The lights were already hot. Not metaphorically, literally hot. Studio lights always are. They bake the air. They dry your throat. They force you to blink more than you want to. But Prince Harry had been under lights his entire life. Red carpets, parades, balcony appearances, interviews. He knew how to sit still. He knew how to smile at the right moments. He knew how to answer questions without answering them. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's why no one expected what happened next. Not the producers, not the interviewer, and certainly not the millions watching live. Because the question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't political. It wasn't even controversial. It was personal. And somehow, it cracked something that had survived nearly 3 decades of silence. Have you ever seen someone lose control in real time? Not the dramatic kind. Not shouting. Not storming off. The quiet kind. The kind where the voice goes first. The eyes second. The breath last. That's what happened to Prince Harry. And it all started with one sentence. Tell me about your mother. At first, everything looked normal. Harry nodded slightly, the way people do when they've answered a question like this 100 times before. Princess Diana, the people's princess, the tragedy the world never forgot. He had spoken about her publicly for years. Carefully, selectively, always with a certain polish, a distance. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the way the interviewer framed it. Maybe it was the word choice. Maybe it was the timing. Or maybe it was none of that. Maybe it was simply that Harry was finally old enough to feel something he had spent his entire life outrunning. For a moment, he tried to keep going. He smiled faintly. He inhaled. He began to speak. And then he stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't belong on live television. You could see it in his shoulders. They rose slightly, then froze. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked down and to the side. The universal signal of someone searching for something buried deep. Not words. Memories. That's when the audience leaned forward. Because everyone knows this story. Or at least they think they do. Princess Diana. Paris. The tunnel. The flashbulbs. The sirens. The headlines. The funeral watched by billions. 2 boys walking behind a coffin while the world watched in stunned grief. We've seen the footage so many times that it almost feels distant now. Historical. Packaged. Controlled. But for Harry, it was never history. It was a night. And on this night, sitting under studio lights decades later, that night came rushing back without warning. What people didn't realize in that moment was that Harry was not just remembering his mother. He was remembering what he saw. And that's where everything changes. Because until now, Harry's public narrative about that night had always followed a familiar path. He didn't know. He was asleep. He was shielded. He was told later. He processed it gradually. A child protected from unbearable truth. That's what we believed. That's what he believed. Until live television stripped away the final layer of control. His voice cracked. Not loudly. Just enough. Enough for the interviewer to hesitate. Enough for the producers to glance at each other behind the cameras. Enough for viewers to feel that something unplanned was happening. Harry paused again. He swallowed. And then he said something he had never said before. Not fully. Not cleanly. But enough to change the meaning of everything that came before it. He referenced a memory. A specific one. A detail from that night. And immediately, his body reacted as if it had betrayed him. Have you ever told the truth by accident? Have you ever started a sentence and realized halfway through that you were about to reveal something you weren't ready to face yourself? That's what this was. Harry wasn't performing grief. He wasn't telling a story he had rehearsed. He wasn't delivering a talking point from therapy or a memoir draft. He was caught off guard by his own mind. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and for a split second, the image of Prince Harry dissolved. What remained was a son. A son who had been 8 years old when the world shattered. A son who had been told to be brave. A son who had been taught, very early, how to swallow pain quietly. People often say children are resilient. And they are. But resilience doesn't mean absence of damage. It means learning how to survive without understanding the cost. Harry learned that lesson young. The royal household believed silence was protection. Structure was safety. Duty was healing. He was kept away from the cameras. Kept away from details. Kept away from the worst of it. Or so everyone thought. But trauma doesn't always obey rules. Memories don't always wait their turn. And grief doesn't care how powerful your family is. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just that Harry cried. It's why. He wasn't overwhelmed by the loss itself. He was overwhelmed by the return of something unfinished, something unresolved, something he had never allowed himself to examine fully. Why now? That's the question no one can stop asking. Why did this happen on live television? Why not in therapy? Why not privately? Why not years ago, when the pain was fresher? The answer may be simpler and more frightening than it seems. Because grief doesn't follow a timeline. Because memories can lie dormant for decades and still carry the emotional weight of the moment they were formed. And because sometimes, the mind waits until it believes you are strong enough to survive the truth. Harry is now older than his mother ever was. Think about that. He has lived longer without her than with her. He has built a family of his own. He has children who will never meet their grandmother. He has spent years fighting the same forces that hunted her. The same cameras, the same pressure, the same expectations. And perhaps, without realizing it, he has been reliving her story from the other side. That changes how memory works. It reframes everything. Suddenly, the night she died is no longer a distant childhood event. It's a warning, a mirror, a moment that echoes forward instead of backward. So when the interviewer asked about Diana, it wasn't just a question about the past. It was a question about identity, about inheritance, about fear. And that's when the dam cracked. Viewers at home noticed the shift immediately. Social media lit up in real time. People weren't debating royal politics. They weren't arguing about narratives. They were watching a human being unravel quietly on live TV. Harry tried to regain control. He laughed nervously. He apologized. He blamed the emotion on exhaustion, on the heaviness of the topic, on the surprise of the question. But his eyes told a different story. There was recognition there. Recognition and shock. As if he had just stumbled upon a locked room in his own mind and realized it had been unlocked all along. Then came the pause. A long one. And then, he almost finished the thought. Almost. That's the part that haunts people who rewatch the clip. Because right before he stops himself, Harry leans forward slightly. His mouth opens. His brows pull together. His voice drops. He is about to say what he saw. And then he stops. Dead stop. It's the kind of interruption that doesn't come from an interviewer. It comes from instinct. From self-protection kicking in at the last possible second. Whatever that memory is, it still carries power. Power strong enough to silence a prince in front of the world. The interviewer gently moves on. The moment passes. The broadcast continues. But nothing feels the same afterward. Because everyone watching knows they just witnessed something rare. Not a scandal. Not a confession. A crack. And cracks are dangerous. They let light in. But they also let truth escape. This moment matters because it challenges everything we think we know about that night. About Harry's childhood. About what was hidden in the name of protection. It raises uncomfortable questions. What if he remembers more than he's ever admitted? What if the official version was never the full version? What if the most traumatic part wasn't what happened in Paris, but what happened after? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all. What if this breakdown wasn't a mistake? What if it was inevitable? Because when pain is buried, it doesn't disappear. It waits. It watches. It chooses its moment. And on this night, under studio lights, in front of millions, with one simple question about his mother, it chose now. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't what Harry revealed. It's what he stopped himself from saying. And what came next would quietly change how people understood that night forever, even though almost no one noticed it at the time. It should have been harmless. That's the word people kept using afterward. Harmless. A soft question. A familiar topic. Something Prince Harry had navigated dozens of times before without breaking stride. And yet, this time, it landed differently. Because the question wasn't just about his mother. It was about memory. And memory is dangerous. Have you ever noticed how the most devastating questions aren't the loud ones? They don't accuse. They don't corner. They arrive gently, almost politely. And by the time you realize what they're really asking, it's already too late. That's exactly what happened here. The interviewer didn't raise their voice, didn't lean in aggressively, didn't push. In fact, the tone was almost reassuring. Calm, curious, human. Can you tell me about the last time you remember thinking about your mother? At first glance, it sounded reflective, almost therapeutic. But beneath it was something sharper. Because it wasn't asking about Diana the icon. It wasn't asking about Diana the global figure. It was asking about Diana the mother. And more importantly, it was asking Harry to place himself back in time, back into his own body, back into a night he had spent his entire life skirting around rather than stepping into. Harry nodded. A small nod. Automatic. The kind people make when they think they know where a question is going. He started with familiar ground. The public language. The language of tribute. Of legacy. Of admiration. He spoke about her warmth. Her laughter. Her ability to make people feel seen. This is the part he knows how to do. This is the part he has rehearsed. But then the interviewer followed up. And this is where things shifted. Do you remember the night she died? That was it. No build-up. No warning. No cushion. Just a direct invitation into the one place Harry has never been able to stay for very long. The room changed instantly. You could feel it even through a screen. Harry didn't answer right away. Instead, he inhaled sharply, as if preparing to dive underwater. His eyes blinked faster than normal. His mouth opened, then closed again. People often mistake hesitation for thoughtfulness. But this wasn't that. This was resistance. His body was saying no while his role demanded yes. He smiled briefly. A reflex. A shield. Then he tried to speak. I was very young, he began. Safe territory again. Age. Distance. Innocence. But then something strange happened. He didn't continue the sentence the way he always had before. Normally, this is where he would say he didn't fully understand. That he was told later. That the adults around him handled it. That he processed it over time. But this time, his words slowed. And then he stopped. Dead air. On live television. For anyone who understands broadcasting, this is a nightmare. Silence is the enemy. Silence feels like failure. Silence creates panic behind the scenes. Producers shifted in their seats. The interviewer waited, unsure whether to rescue him or let the moment breathe. Harry looked down at his hands. And that's when the question truly did its damage. Because it forced him to confront something he had never fully allowed himself to acknowledge. He wasn't just remembering being told. He was remembering being there. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the weight he'd been carrying suddenly shifted position. His breathing became uneven. Not dramatic, just human. He said something then that most viewers barely noticed. He said, I remember more than I used to think I did. That line should have stopped the interview cold. But it didn't. Because at the time, no one knew what it meant. Harry himself may not have known what it meant until the words left his mouth. Memory is like that. You don't always know what you're carrying until you feel it move. This question opened a door Harry had spent decades keeping shut. Not locked. Just avoided. Psychologists often say that the brain protects children by fragmenting traumatic experiences. Instead of a complete narrative, memories become scattered impressions. Sounds. Images. Feelings. Sensations. Not stories. And Harry had lived most of his life believing that's all he had. Fragments. But fragments can be dangerous when they start connecting. As he sat there, under those lights, being watched by millions, something connected. And his face betrayed him. His eyes grew glassy, not with tears yet, but with recognition. The kind that comes when something clicks into place and you realize you've been wrong about yourself for a very long time. The interviewer noticed. You can see it if you rewatch the footage. A slight pause. A softening of tone. They asked gently, what do you remember? That was the moment everything tipped. Harry didn't answer right away. Instead, he shook his head once. Slowly, as if trying to clear something away. I don't usually talk about this, he said. That's when the audience leaned in. Because when someone says that, you know one of two things is coming. Either they'll retreat, or they'll cross a line they can't uncross. Harry crossed it. Not fully, not explicitly, but enough. He referenced a sensation, a visual, a moment tied specifically to that night. And the instant he did, his composure collapsed. His voice faltered. His throat tightened. He pressed his lips together, fighting something rising fast. This wasn't grief on display. This was shock. Shock at himself. Have you ever surprised yourself with your own memory? Have you ever realized that something you thought you imagined might actually be real? That's what happened here. Harry wasn't crying because he missed his mother. He was reacting to the realization that his understanding of that night had been incomplete. And incomplete stories are dangerous. They leave room for fear, for doubt, for guilt. Guilt is especially powerful in children who survive loss. Many grow up believing they should have done something, said something, known something. Harry has spoken before about guilt surrounding his mother's death, about unanswered phone calls, about wishing he had said more. But this moment suggested something deeper, that he had seen something his adult mind had never fully examined. And that realization hit him without warning, without preparation. The interviewer hesitated again, this time clearly unsure whether to continue. "Are you okay?" they asked quietly. Harry nodded, but the nod was unconvincing. He wiped his face quickly, almost angrily, as if frustrated with himself. "I didn't expect that to come up," he admitted. That sentence is crucial, because it tells us this wasn't planned. This wasn't a controlled disclosure. This was memory breaking through a carefully maintained surface. Producers later confirmed that this segment was not pre-scripted. The question was approved, yes, but the direction it took was not anticipated. Harry was supposed to give a reflective answer, a composed answer, a safe answer. Instead, he stumbled into something raw, something unresolved. And here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the narrative has been that Harry was shielded completely, that he was asleep, that he was told in the morning, that he didn't witness anything related to the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. And yet, here he was, implying otherwise, not stating it outright, but hinting at it strongly enough to unsettle even himself. The human brain doesn't fabricate trauma reactions out of nowhere. Emotional responses like the one Harry displayed are tied to lived experience, not secondhand stories. This raises uncomfortable questions. Was he more aware that night than anyone realized? Was he exposed to something that was later minimized or forgotten? Or did his mind reconstruct something based on fragments, filling in gaps over time? The truth may be a combination of all three. And that's what makes it so powerful. Harry stopped himself again. Mid-thought, mid-memory. You could almost see the internal struggle. Say it. Don't say it. You've already gone too far. You haven't gone far enough. Live television doesn't allow for therapy pauses. It doesn't allow for grounding exercises. It doesn't allow for emotional processing. It demands continuation. So the interviewer gently steered the conversation away. They moved on to broader themes. Healing, time, legacy. Harry followed. He answered. He smiled again. But the damage was done. Because once a memory surfaces, it doesn't politely retreat just because the topic changes. It lingers. It waits. And that moment planted a seed not just in the audience's mind, but in Harry's. A seed that would continue to grow long after the cameras stopped rolling. People watching sensed it. They felt the shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. This wasn't just another emotional interview. This was the beginning of something unraveling. Because Harry hadn't just been asked about his mother. He had been asked to revisit the one night his entire life pivoted. And for the first time, he didn't stay on the surface. But the most unsettling part? This wasn't the first time that question had been asked. It was simply the first time his mind was ready to answer it differently. And once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly. Because the next thing Harry would confront wasn't what the world remembers about that night. It was what a child remembers when no one thinks he's paying attention. And that would change everything. Everyone remembers where they were. That phrase gets repeated every time a global tragedy is mentioned. It's a way of claiming proximity to history. A way of saying, I was there too. But for Prince Harry, that phrase means something very different. Because when people say they remember where they were the night Princess Diana died, they usually mean a couch, a television, a breaking news banner, a stunned phone call. Harry remembers a house. A quiet one. A house that did not behave the way the world outside it did. While Paris burned into history, while sirens echoed through tunnels and newsrooms scrambled, while broadcasters interrupted programming and millions sat frozen in disbelief, the place where Harry was that night felt strangely contained. Too contained. That's the part that doesn't sit right once you start looking closer. Harry was 8 years old. Old enough to sense tension. Old enough to notice when adults are lying by omission. Old enough to feel when something is wrong even if no one explains what that something is. Children don't need details to know the air has changed. They feel it first. That night, the air changed. But no one sat him down immediately. No one rushed into his room with urgency. No one shattered the illusion of normalcy all at once. And that, paradoxically, may have been the most traumatic part. Because confusion is often more damaging than truth. Think about it. Imagine being a child in a place that suddenly feels heavy. Doors opening and closing quietly. Adults whispering. Phones ringing and being answered in hushed tones. Faces that look tight. Eyes that look tired. Attention you can't name. And no explanation. Harry has spoken before about being asleep when his mother died. About being woken later. About being told in a controlled, measured way. That may be true, but sleep doesn't erase perception. And memory doesn't require full consciousness to form. The human brain is always recording, especially in moments of stress. What people often miss is that trauma isn't always the event itself. Sometimes, it's the moments around it. The before, the after, the silence in between. That night, Harry remembers being in a familiar place that suddenly felt unfamiliar. He remembers being aware without understanding, sensing something enormous had happened, but not being given the language to process it. And that kind of dissonance is dangerous. Because when a child isn't told the truth, they don't stop searching for it. They fill in the gaps themselves. Psychologists call this meaning-making. The brain's attempt to create a coherent story from incomplete information. For adults, it can be uncomfortable. For children, it can be terrifying. Because children often assume responsibility for things they don't understand. Harry didn't know what had happened, but he knew something had gone wrong. And when something goes wrong in a child's world, the first question they ask themselves is not what. It's why. And the second question is even worse. Was it my fault? No one likes to talk about that part. But it's common. Especially in sudden loss. Especially when the child isn't given clear information. The royal household believed they were protecting Harry and William by maintaining calm, by delaying details, by managing the flow of information. And from an adult perspective, that makes sense. But children don't experience protection the way adults imagine they do. They experience absence. That night, the adults around Harry knew exactly what was happening. He didn't. That imbalance creates anxiety. And anxiety sharpens memory. Harry has described that night not as chaotic, but as eerie. Too quiet. Too controlled. Too careful. That's important. Because chaos is easier to process than unnatural calm. Chaos matches emotion. Silence does not. He has spoken about waking up and sensing that something was off. Not being able to put his finger on it. Feeling watched without knowing why. Feeling like the house itself was holding its breath. That sensation stays with you. Especially when no one explains it. Imagine being 8 years old and feeling like the world has tilted slightly, but everyone around you is pretending it hasn't. You begin to doubt yourself. You begin to question your instincts. And that's when memory starts to fracture. Instead of a clear narrative, you're left with flashes. A look on someone's face. A tone of voice. A sound in the distance. A room that suddenly feels colder. These are the building blocks of traumatic memory. Not facts. Feelings. Harry didn't know the full truth that night, but he knew enough to feel unsafe. And that matters, because later, when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't land in a neutral space. It crashes into a landscape already shaped by fear and confusion. When he was told about his mother's death, it didn't come as a complete shock. It came as confirmation. Confirmation of a dread that had already taken root. That's why that night never closed for him. It never resolved. Instead of being a single, contained event, it became an open loop. An unanswered question that followed him into adolescence, into adulthood, into public life. People often assume that because Harry was young, he didn't fully grasp what happened. But children grasp more than we give them credit for. They may not understand the logistics, but they understand loss. They understand absence. And they understand when the adults around them are afraid. What complicates Harry's memory even further is the public nature of the tragedy. Most children who lose a parent do so in private. Harry lost his mother in front of the world. But that night, before the world fully intruded, there was a liminal space. A brief window where the tragedy existed inside a controlled environment. Inside walls. Inside whispers. Inside withheld information. That space is where memory distorts. Because it's not anchored to external reality yet. It's internal, and internal experiences are harder to untangle later. Harry has said that for years, he didn't allow himself to think about that night too deeply. He accepted the version of events he was given. He trusted the narrative handed to him. Why wouldn't he? Children trust adults, especially when those adults are institutions, especially when those institutions are designed to project certainty. But trust doesn't erase intuition, And intuition has a way of resurfacing. As Harry grew older, he began to revisit that night in his mind. Not consciously at first, just in fragments, in dreams, in emotional reactions he couldn't explain. Certain questions would trigger discomfort. Certain images would cause a visceral response. But he didn't connect the dots. Not until much later. And certainly not until that interview. That's what makes the live TV moment so significant. It wasn't just grief spilling out. It was a memory colliding with an adult understanding for the first time. When Harry referenced remembering more than he thought, he wasn't talking about facts. He was talking about sensations, about awareness, about presence. That's why his reaction was so intense. Because the mind had just renegotiated the past. Have you ever had that happen? Have you ever realized that a childhood memory you dismissed as vague or imagined was actually real? It's disorienting. It destabilizes your sense of self. Because it forces you to ask a terrifying question. If I was wrong about that, what else have I misunderstood? Harry's entire relationship to his mother's death has been shaped by what he believed he didn't know. But what if the truth is that he knew more than anyone realized? What if the protection wasn't complete? What if the silence didn't shield him, but instead left him alone with impressions he couldn't process? That possibility reframes everything. It explains the delayed emotional processing, the years of anger without a clear target, the discomfort with media intrusion, the sense that something was unresolved, even when he couldn't articulate what. And it explains why that question on live television hit him like a physical blow. Because it forced him to stand at the intersection of then and now. The child who sensed something was wrong, and the adult who finally understood what it was. But there's another layer to this, one that makes the story even more unsettling. Because that night wasn't just about what Harry didn't know. It was also about what he may have been intentionally kept from later. As time passed, the official story solidified. Details became fixed. Narratives hardened. And once a narrative hardens, it becomes dangerous to challenge. Especially within a family and institution that values continuity above all else. Harry learned early that certain questions weren't encouraged. Certain topics weren't revisited. Certain memories were better left untouched. So he adapted. He buried the discomfort. He accepted the version of events he was given. And he moved forward. But memory doesn't disappear just because you stop asking questions. It waits. And sometimes, it waits for decades. Until one day, under the wrong lights, with the wrong question, at the wrong moment. It comes back, not as a story, but as a feeling so strong it steals your breath. That's what we saw on live television. Not a man remembering a headline, a child remembering a night. And that realization opens a door that can't be closed again. Because once you accept that your memory might be incomplete, you're forced to ask why. Why were things handled the way they were? Why was silence chosen over explanation? Why was protection prioritized over understanding? And most importantly, what else was hidden in the name of keeping him safe? Because the next part of this story isn't about the night itself. It's about the strategy that followed, the decision to shield, the belief that silence equals safety, and how that decision may have backfired in ways no one anticipated. But what came next didn't just shape Harry's childhood. It quietly rewired how he learned to feel, and that would echo for the rest of his life. The concept of protection is tricky, especially when the person you're trying to protect is a child. Adults often think shielding a child from trauma is a gift, a kindness, even a moral obligation. But children experience protection differently. To them, silence can feel like absence. Control can feel like abandonment. And in Harry's case, the protective measures of the palace may have created their own kind of trauma. When Princess Diana died, the adults around Harry had a clear objective: maintain composure, prevent panic, and control the flow of information. They believed that by doing so, they were safeguarding two young boys from unimaginable pain. On the surface, that seems logical. You don't want an 8-year-old seeing chaos that even adults struggle to process. But the unintended consequence is subtle and profound. The child feels the weight of the world pressing down without the words to understand it. Harry has spoken indirectly about those early protective measures. The careful explanations, the delayed truths, the selective exposure to events. He was told only what adults deemed necessary. He was guided toward a version of the story that minimized emotional impact. And for decades, he trusted that guidance. He learned to navigate the world based on the information he was given. But the problem with curated truth is that it leaves gaps. And gaps are fertile ground for imagination, for conjecture, for emotional burden. Children have an incredible capacity to sense when things are wrong, even when they're not told explicitly. Harry didn't know all the details that night, but he knew enough to feel that the world had shifted. Doors opened and closed in hushed tones. Voices dropped to whispers. The normal rhythms of the household were interrupted, and he noticed. He may have been asleep when the news arrived formally, but sleep does not erase perception. Subconsciously, a child absorbs the atmosphere, the tension, the urgency. What makes trauma so insidious is that it is not always tied to a concrete memory of the event. It can be tied to ambient awareness, the feeling in the air, the expressions on adult faces, the sense that something irrevocable has happened. These subtle cues are often encoded in the brain, lingering for years until a trigger brings them to the surface. For Harry, the live television interview became that trigger. The carefully worded question acted like a key turning in a lock, forcing a memory into the present that had been quietly simmering for decades. Think about that for a moment. How many of us carry fragments of past events that we don't consciously acknowledge? Images, sounds, feelings that we may have suppressed or forgotten, only to have them emerge unexpectedly. Now imagine experiencing that publicly, under intense scrutiny, with millions of people watching and cameras capturing every micro-expression, every subtle tremor. That's what happened to Harry. His reaction was immediate but subtle. At first, it was physical, the slight tightening of his jaw, the blink of disbelief, the shift of his posture. Then it became verbal, a crack in the narrative he had maintained for years. He started to describe a detail, a specific sensation from that night, and his voice faltered. His words were not dramatic, they didn't scream, but they were human. And the raw authenticity of that moment is what made it so powerful. Psychologists explain that children form their earliest understandings of trauma through sensation before they can process it logically. A child does not always comprehend an event fully, but experiences it intensely. Harry's memory of that night, therefore, is less about reconstructing facts and more about reliving the emotional essence of the moment. That essence had been hidden, suppressed, but never gone. And now, decades later, it demanded acknowledgement. The palace's well-intentioned protection created an ironic paradox. By shielding him from the full reality of his mother's death, they inadvertently left him with an incomplete but deeply felt impression. This incomplete memory became a source of internal conflict. He knew something had happened, but he was denied the tools to fully understand it. That tension stayed with him, shaping his reactions, his emotions, his understanding of loss, and even his relationships with others. And then, of course, the world intruded. The public narrative of Diana's death was ubiquitous. Footage of the crash, news coverage, public mourning, it surrounded him. Yet the private experience, the one he carried in his own mind, was different from what the public saw. He had lived in the shadow of a story that wasn't entirely his own. He had experienced the event personally, but the version available to him was curated, filtered, incomplete. That dissonance added layers of complexity to his grief. By the time he reached adolescence, Harry had developed coping mechanisms. He learned to compartmentalize, to perform composure in public, to navigate media attention with calculated responses. But compartmentalization does not erase emotion, it only postpones it. And emotions, once postponed, can re-emerge with intensity when triggered. That live interview became precisely such a trigger, confronting him not only with grief, but with decades of unresolved memory and suppressed sensation. It's important to note that children's perception of trauma often surpasses what adults assume. Even if a child is told nothing, even if they are shielded, they can internalize responsibility for events they barely understand. Harry's early exposure to tension, secrecy, and controlled explanations may have instilled a subtle sense of accountability or helplessness, despite his young age. This dynamic makes the later emotional breakthrough even more profound. It's not just grief. It's the confrontation with a memory that has been shaping his life from the shadows. When the interviewer asked about the night, Harry's initial response was careful, rehearsed, guarded. He began with familiar reflections, speaking about his mother in measured, composed terms. But as he continued, fragments of the long-buried memory began to surface. His body betrayed him before his words did, slight tremors in his hands, a change in his breathing, a subtle stiffness in his posture. These micro-expressions, imperceptible to many viewers, signal a mind navigating unexpected emotional terrain. Then came the most critical moment. Harry began to articulate a sensation, a glimpse, a fragment, a truth from that night. His voice faltered. He paused. The words hung in the air. The production crew held their collective breath, unsure whether to intervene. And in that pause, viewers glimpsed the human reality behind the royal persona. A child confronting a trauma long postponed, a memory demanding recognition, a grief that had been silently building for decades. This moment was not just a breakdown. It was an intersection of past and present, child and adult, private grief and public expectation. And it illustrates a profound truth. Shielding someone from trauma does not erase it. It postpones it. And when the postponed trauma finally emerges, it can do so in unexpected, sometimes uncontrollable ways. Harry's reaction provides an invaluable window into this process. His hesitation, his faltering words, his fleeting expressions of vulnerability, they are all manifestations of decades-old memory and emotion resurfacing. The interview became a stage not merely for reflection, but for a psychological reckoning, a confrontation with the incomplete, imperfect, and deeply human truth of what he experienced as a child. The world may remember Princess Diana's death as a singular, catastrophic event, marked by headlines, public mourning, and historical documentation. But Harry's memory reveals the subtler, more insidious layers, the quiet moments of awareness in the household, the emotional fragments that were never fully articulated, the internalization of tension and fear, and the lifelong impact of being shielded from the full narrative. These insights underscore why the live television breakdown resonated so profoundly. Audiences were witnessing the culmination of decades of unprocessed emotion, carefully curated silence, and the natural consequences of child psychology intersecting with public exposure. What appeared as a momentary lapse of composure was, in reality, the manifestation of complex emotional processing. An unintentional disclosure of how deeply an event can shape a life, even when it is mediated through protection and control. And yet, even in this unraveling, there is remarkable resilience. Harry did not collapse entirely. He navigated the situation with a combination of instinct, composure, and human vulnerability. He allowed the memory to surface without letting it overwhelm him completely. That delicate balance between exposure and containment, emotion and control, is what makes the moment so compelling and instructive. But the most striking aspect is this. Once memory begins to surface, it does not wait. It demands acknowledgement. It intersects with present circumstances in ways that can be unpredictable, sometimes uncomfortable, and always revealing. In Harry's case, the live interview became the catalyst for a long-overdue confrontation with his own history. The carefully curated protection of his childhood could no longer contain the truth of his experience. And so, we return to the question that began it all. What did Harry truly remember that night? What fragment of awareness, previously suppressed, emerged under the scrutiny of millions? And how did this long-delayed confrontation shape his understanding of himself, his mother, and his past? These questions remain partially unanswered because memory is not a finite resource. It evolves. It reinterprets. It resurfaces unpredictably. And in Harry's case, it forced a reckoning on live television that no script could have anticipated. Memory is a strange thing. It is selective. It is malleable. It is sometimes cruel. And for Prince Harry, the memory of that night, the night his mother died, was not a static image but a living, shifting presence that had haunted him in ways he could barely articulate. For years, he had relied on fragments, impressions, and the curated narrative fed to him by those around him. But as adults, we sometimes forget the power of those fragments. A sound, a smell, a fleeting image, they can carry more emotional weight than any full story. And that's what makes the moment on live television so extraordinary. Because when Harry began to recall what he had felt that night, he wasn't merely recounting facts. He was reliving sensations, emotions, and truths that had been waiting decades to be expressed. That moment exposed the fragility of memory and the intensity of long-suppressed grief. Imagine being a child in a household that suddenly changes. Everything familiar, the walls, the rooms, the voices, the routine, is altered in subtle ways. Adults whisper. Phones ring in hushed tones. The atmosphere thickens. You sense that something has gone terribly wrong, but no one explains it. You are left to navigate the tension alone. That is exactly what Harry experienced. Children are intuitive. Even without explicit knowledge, they detect disruption. And when protection takes the form of silence, it often feels less like care and more like exclusion. Harry's early experiences shaped a landscape of emotional alertness and hyper-awareness, laying the groundwork for how he would later process grief, loss, and trauma. When the cameras focused on him that day, the carefully maintained layers of protection and composure were stripped away. The question about his mother acted as a key, unlocking long-hidden emotional pathways. His body responded before his mind had fully caught up. Slight tremors in his hands, a tightening of the jaw, shifts in posture. The micro-expressions of someone suddenly exposed to an internal truth too large to contain. Then came the verbal cue, a reference to a memory. Not a full revelation, not a narrative, but a fragment, a glimpse. Enough to reveal that the official, curated story was incomplete. Enough to suggest that Harry's understanding of that night extended beyond what had been publicly shared. The audience may have interpreted this as a moment of vulnerability, and it was. But it was also a profound psychological event. When a memory suppressed for decades suddenly emerges, it disrupts more than composure. It challenges identity, perception, and understanding. For Harry, it was a collision of childhood perception and adult reflection, a confrontation with the self he had been for years and the self he had become. The protective measures intended to shield him inadvertently created a complex emotional topography. He was taught to compartmentalize, to perform resilience, to navigate public life with controlled emotion. But compartmentalization does not erase trauma, it postpones it. And postponed trauma, when triggered, can emerge explosively. This is precisely what occurred during that live interview. Harry's brief lapse in composure revealed the presence of a memory long denied expression. Psychologists would recognize this as an involuntary memory retrieval, one in which suppressed or fragmented memory becomes conscious under emotional or environmental triggers. In Harry's case, the trigger was subtle, a carefully framed question, the presence of cameras, the live audience. And yet the impact was immense. Have you ever noticed how the smallest prompt can unlock the deepest buried memory? How a scent, a sound, or even a question can send your mind spiraling through time? For Harry, that question acted as a psychological lever, forcing decades of suppressed awareness to the surface. It is not simply grief manifesting. It is the brain negotiating with itself, reconciling fragments of memory with the present reality. And therein lies the complexity. Memory is not merely factual. It is experiential. It is emotional. It is a synthesis of perception, sensation, and cognition. Harry's memory of that night is layered. The child who sensed danger, the child who felt loss, the child who navigated uncertainty, all colliding with the adult who has processed grief through reflection, therapy, and life experience. The interplay is both delicate and powerful. What makes it so compelling is the contradiction inherent in it. On one hand, Harry had been told he was safe, that the adults around him were in control, that he would not be exposed to what was deemed too traumatic. On the other hand, the child inside him knew differently. He had observed, intuited, and felt the gravity of the situation. This duality, the knowledge of the child and the understanding of the adult, creates a tension that surfaces physically, emotionally, and cognitively when triggered. As Harry began to articulate even fragments of his memory, his composure faltered. His voice cracked, not dramatically, but just enough to convey internal struggle. His body language communicated more than words could, a subtle tightening of muscles, a shift in posture, a pause that stretched uncomfortably. These are the involuntary manifestations of a mind confronting buried truth. The interviewers and production team sensed it immediately. Live television thrives on control, on predictability. But here was a moment beyond prediction. A human being, a child grown into a man, experiencing a memory in real time that had been carefully managed and suppressed for decades. The dynamics of control, protection, and performance collided spectacularly. And then the fragment emerged. Not fully articulated, but enough to suggest a previously unspoken truth. Harry was not merely recalling events. He was acknowledging a memory that challenged the narrative he had grown up with. He was asserting, subtly, that his understanding had always been more complex than what adults had conveyed. This is where the psychological stakes rise. Memory retrieval of this nature often catalyzes secondary emotional responses: guilt, confusion, anger, and sorrow. Harry's reaction included all of these, even if only fleetingly. The lapse in composure was not an act of weakness, but a manifestation of decades-long emotional processing finally intersecting with present consciousness. And it did not end there. The aftermath of that retrieval was immediate and profound. Viewers sensed something different. Social media reacted in real time. Commentary focused on the visible vulnerability, yet few could articulate why it felt so consequential. Because it was not simply about a moment of grief. It was about the revelation that memory, even suppressed, has agency. It surfaces when it must, and when it does, it is uncontainable. Harry's experience illustrates a fundamental principle of human psychology. Protection is complex, and shielding someone from trauma does not eliminate it. Instead, it postpones its expression, often in ways unpredictable and emotionally charged. The carefully curated narrative of his childhood, designed to protect, intersected with latent memory in a way that produced a deeply authentic emotional response. The implications are profound, not just for understanding Harry's experience, but for understanding how humans navigate trauma more broadly. Suppression, compartmentalization, and delayed processing are common coping mechanisms. Yet they carry the risk of resurfacing in moments of vulnerability, stress, or exposure, precisely what occurred during the interview. Harry's brief but powerful lapse in composure is thus a case study in memory, emotion, and human resilience. It demonstrates the enduring impact of early experiences, the persistence of unprocessed trauma, and the complex interplay between childhood perception and adult understanding. It also reminds us of the universality of human grief, that loss, memory, and emotion are never fully constrained by time or circumstance. And yet, even as these truths unfolded on live television, Harry maintained a delicate balance. He allowed the memory to surface without fully surrendering to it. He navigated between expression and containment, vulnerability and composure, reflection and performance. That balance, tenuous though it may have been, is what made the moment both human and profoundly relatable. But there is a deeper layer, one that complicates everything further. This was not merely a personal reflection. It was an interaction with history, with narrative, and with public perception. The memory that surfaced challenged not only Harry's own understanding, but also the curated story of the night that had been presented to the world. It questioned what had been omitted, what had been protected, and what had been reconstructed over time. And that is where the story truly deepens. Because the memory, once unearthed, does not remain neutral. It reshapes interpretation. It demands reconciliation. And it sets the stage for revelations that are more complex, more unsettling, and ultimately more human than the public narrative has ever allowed. The palace always valued order, structure, composure. They taught young Harry and William that appearances mattered. That duty came before emotion. That control was synonymous with strength. And for decades, Harry internalized this lesson. But control has limits, especially when it comes to grief. Children, even royal ones, cannot suppress intuition. They cannot fully ignore the currents of fear, loss, and confusion around them. Harry learned early that his own perception mattered less than the narrative adults wanted him to accept. He learned to smile, to nod, to respond with appropriate decorum. But inside, the questions persisted. The unease lingered. The fragments of memory gathered dust until they were ready to speak. The night his mother died was a catalyst, not a conclusion. It didn't end with the crash, the sirens, the funeral. For Harry, it was a series of small, disjointed events that lodged themselves in his memory. A whispered conversation down the hall. A phone call answered hurriedly. A door closing too firmly. These minor incidents created a tapestry of tension and anticipation, laying the groundwork for decades of emotional complexity. He grew up navigating these invisible rules. Public appearances, media scrutiny, and familial expectations all demanded a kind of emotional armor. He learned to compartmentalize not out of choice, but necessity. The young prince became adept at performing stability, at smiling through discomfort, at projecting calm even when internalized turmoil brewed beneath the surface. But trauma is persistent. It doesn't adhere to schedules. It doesn't follow the polite rules of decorum. It waits. It bides its time. And when the conditions are right, exposure, pressure, or a triggering memory, it resurfaces with intensity. The live television interview became that catalyst. The carefully framed question about his mother, so innocuous on the surface, acted as a key. It unlocked long-dormant fragments of memory and emotion. The subtle, almost imperceptible signs of internal struggle were unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. A brief tightening of the jaw, a shift in posture, a flicker in the eyes. These micro-movements betrayed the emotional weight Harry had been carrying silently for years. The fragments of memory he referenced were not complete narratives. They were sensations, glimpses, impressions, enough to suggest that the story he had been told as a child was only part of the truth. This is crucial because it reveals the duality of Harry's experience, the reality as he was allowed to know it, and the reality as he perceived it through intuition and subconscious observation. Psychologists would note that this duality is common in childhood trauma, particularly when the child is shielded from the full scope of the event. The mind creates a patchwork of understanding, combining observed details with imagination, fear, and instinct. Over time, these fragments can grow into powerful emotional triggers, waiting for the right moment to surface. For Harry, the moment arrived unexpectedly under the gaze of millions. His initial response was measured, rehearsed, and familiar. He spoke of his mother in broad, respectful terms, reflecting on her warmth, her humor, her impact. But as he continued, fragments of the long-suppressed memory intruded, disrupting the narrative he had rehearsed. His composure faltered. His voice cracked. The careful veneer of control was pierced by an uncontrollable truth. This lapse was not dramatic in the sense of shouting or sobbing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those not paying attention. But for those who understand the psychology of grief and memory, it was profound. The intersection of childhood experience and adult understanding produced a moment of authenticity that could not be scripted or faked. And then came the most revealing moment, the hint of a memory he had never publicly disclosed. Not the events themselves, but the awareness, the sensation, the presence he had felt as a child. This is what makes the moment so unsettling, because it implies that the curated version of the night, the version he had been told to accept, was incomplete. It suggests that Harry had internalized more than anyone realized, more than the adults around him intended. The live setting amplified the impact. Cameras captured micro-expressions, subtle gestures, and fleeting emotional cues. Millions witnessed a breakdown not in the sense of losing control entirely, but in the sense of truth breaking through decades of careful suppression. It was a moment of unintentional revelation, one that exposed both the vulnerability and resilience of a man shaped by extraordinary circumstances. This resurfacing of memory also illustrates a broader psychological principle. Protection can sometimes create its own form of trauma. By shielding a child from immediate pain, adults may inadvertently create a situation where the child internalizes confusion, fear, and a sense of helplessness. Over time, these unprocessed emotions can manifest unexpectedly, often triggered by events that would seem innocuous to an observer. Harry's live reaction exemplifies this principle. It is not merely a display of grief, but a window into the long-term effects of carefully managed childhood trauma. It highlights the tension between the narrative he was permitted to know and the reality he perceived, revealing the complexity of human memory and emotion. And yet, even in this emotional turbulence, Harry maintained remarkable composure. He allowed the memory to surface without allowing it to overwhelm him completely. He balanced vulnerability with control, exposure with discretion, and reflection with performance. This delicate equilibrium made the moment not only authentic, but deeply instructive about the human experience of loss, memory, and resilience. The implications extend beyond Harry's personal narrative. They challenge assumptions about how trauma should be handled, how children process loss, and how protective measures can have unintended consequences. They also force us to reconsider public narratives, especially those involving iconic figures whose personal experiences are filtered through institutional control and media framing. As Harry navigated the interview, he demonstrated a rare human phenomenon, the conscious negotiation with long-suppressed memory. The fragments that emerged were not complete stories, but they were enough to disrupt the curated narrative, to reveal the complexity of lived experience, and to challenge the audience's assumptions about what it means to grieve, to remember, and to survive. This chapter underscores a critical truth. Grief, memory, and trauma are not linear. They do not adhere to social conventions, public expectation, or institutional control. They persist, evolve, and resurface in ways that are unpredictable and often unavoidable. Harry's live television moment is a case study in this principle, demonstrating the enduring impact of early experiences and the complexity of human emotion. But what comes next pushes the boundaries even further. Because once the fragments of memory emerge, they demand integration, reflection, and sometimes confrontation. And Harry is only at the beginning of that process. A process that would shape not only his understanding of that night, but his entire approach to grief, family, and public life. The aftermath of that night, both in Paris and within the walls of the royal household, set the stage for years of complex emotional navigation. For Prince Harry, the official story of his mother's death was always mediated, carefully curated, and filtered. Adults believed that by controlling information, they could shield him from the brunt of grief. Yet in practice, this created a nuanced paradox. The more he was protected from the full narrative, the more his mind was left to interpret fragments on its own. Children naturally fill gaps in knowledge with their own assumptions. They sense tension, notice changes in behavior, and register emotional undercurrents, even if they do not fully comprehend them. Harry, only 8 years old, was particularly sensitive to these shifts. The whispered conversations down hallways, the abrupt silences, the hurried phone calls. These were all pieces of a puzzle he was too young to complete. And that uncompleted puzzle lodged itself in memory, quietly shaping perception and emotional response for decades. Psychologists describe this as latent trauma, an experience whose emotional weight is not fully processed at the time but resurfaces later, often in unexpected ways. This latent trauma is precisely what erupted during the live television interview. The trigger was subtle, a question posed with careful curiosity about his mother. The simplicity of the question belied the emotional complexity it unleashed. At first, Harry responded as he had many times before, with measured reflection, speaking in broad strokes about his mother's warmth, her compassion, her sense of humor. These were safe, rehearsed reflections. But then the fragments of memory began to rise. Not fully formed memories, but impressions and sensations, the subtle recognition of details he had internalized as a child. A glance, a sound, a fleeting image, small pieces that suddenly demanded acknowledgement. His body responded before his mind could fully process what was happening. Slight shifts in posture, the tightening of his jaw, a subtle tremor in his hands, all micro-expressions of the emotional weight he carried. These are involuntary, physiological manifestations of suppressed memory encountering present awareness. The human brain, when confronted with long-buried trauma, responds first through the body, then the mind. What makes this reaction so compelling is its authenticity. Unlike scripted television moments or premeditated interviews, this was spontaneous, uncontrollable, and deeply human. The audience witnessed a collision between the child who had experienced the night in fragments and the adult who had learned to navigate grief with composure. That intersection of past and present, private and public, suppression and acknowledgement, is rare to see and difficult to articulate. And yet, the significance extends beyond the moment itself. It raises questions about how grief is managed within families, especially high-profile ones. Adults often believe that shielding children is protective. In Harry's case, this shielding may have delayed emotional confrontation, but it did not eliminate it. Instead, it created latent pressures that surfaced when he was finally in a context that allowed, or forced, acknowledgement. This also complicates public narratives about Diana's death. Most accounts focus on the crash, the global mourning, the media coverage, and the adult perspectives of loss. But Harry's experience highlights a different dimension, the child's perspective, shaped by observation, intuition, and suppressed awareness. He was not merely a passive recipient of information. He was an active observer, processing stimuli he was not yet equipped to understand fully.